let's help the client through this time. It's important that we deliver this. It's important we get that into the market. So we throw all resources to getting the job out the door, but ultimately those resources aren't profitable. The question of those agencies currently operating on the basis of we'll take our lead from our clients, depending on what the client wants to do at what stage. And there's a lovely term that has come to the fore over the last couple of months, and that's the term of vicarious trauma. And it's the trauma that is experienced by the client that is taken on by the service provider, in this case, the agency. And what so often happens is that in the name of partnership, we see agencies embedding themselves in their client environment, whether that's physically embedding or mentally or emotionally embedding in the client's environment. And so what the changes that happen and the stress and the anxiety that happens in the client environment translates over into the agency world. And obviously that has an impact on things like your creative engine, your production engine, your timelines, what you're willing to do in order to meet the demands of the client. And time again, I've seen in my procurement days, I've seen that becoming the issue in the agency that directly impacts ability to deliver, and again directly impacts the revenue. So while it's not necessarily felt at the time, because what is the focus? The focus is about let's help the client through this time. It's important that we deliver this. It's important we get that into the market. So we throw all resources to getting the job out the door, but ultimately those resources aren't profitable. We're over-investing time. We're over-investing and burning people out through that process. So that notion of let's take the lead from the client, for want of a better term, is suicidal, and actually is short term. So the question again, and let me pop the business coach hat on. The question is about what are the fundamentals in the agency business right now that contribute to sustainability, that contribute to resilience, and how much are we managing that through business discipline rather than through vicarious trauma?
Yeah, I think it's a crucial question, and I think it goes back to something we've said right from the beginning, which is that an agency needs to manage its business for itself. It can't just manage its business according to what the client's needs are, because it has to be managing its business for its own objectives and its own welfare and its own welfare of its people. Of course, they're dependent on client spend and what clients do. We know all of that, but actually an agency is a business on its own. It has to be able, and it has to be well run. And I think those business skills have been really tested during this past few months. I think the easy part was getting the technology right. I think the easy part was actually putting all the tech in place that everybody could work remotely, and aren't we clever, and how have we done this? Great. But now, the difficulty is, or at least now it's about managing this and saying, okay, we've done all of that. We know we can do all of that. Great. Okay. We have to go back to the office in order to make sure that we are still building our culture, that we haven't lost that culture. How are we going to manage that step by step? How are we going to handle certain things? What are we going to do? And I think for agencies to decide that on their own, is what they have to do, because agencies are not large corporates. They are small to medium-sized businesses in the greater scheme of things. So they have to have their own culture, and they have to have their own way of doing things. And they have to be really clear on revenue generation. So we might see some really interesting innovation coming through, where agencies come up with ideas where they can generate their own revenue without being so dependent on clients. we might see more outcome-based pricing going on, which I'm starting to see a little bit more of. So I think there's a huge opportunity for innovation here as well.
Yeah. So I want to pick up that question of outcomes-based remuneration, and I want to throw a slightly different spin to it, and maybe a slightly different name, in order to provoke some thinking in a different direction, and not so much outcomes-based remuneration, but value-based remuneration. And so value-based remuneration is a different conversation because it changes the lens through which we view that. Arguably, outcome-based remuneration is a client-based lens, while value-based remuneration is a shared lens.
Yeah.
It's the value that the agency brings into the execution, the strategy, and the conversation, and it's the value that the client receives as part of that, and in meeting their strategy. While an outcome-based remuneration is about, have you helped me meet my goals at whatever cost? And so we have the conversation of skin in the game, but it's skin in the game in a one-way direction. And this might be a little bit of a contentious conversation right now, but skin in the game in that conversation, in the conversation of outcome-based remuneration, typically benefits the client more than it benefits the agency. And so the challenge back to the agency is, how much of that conversation are you in control of? How much of that conversation are you informing? And how much of that way of working do you consistently, and can you consistently apply from one client to the next? Otherwise, your outcome-based remuneration with client A is going to be different to your outcome-based remuneration with client B, C, D, and E. And what you end up with, to come back to your previous point around culture, is a schizophrenic organization, a schizophrenic agency with multiple staffing structures, multiple team structures, and multiple revenue models, which, with the best will in the world, becomes a little bit of a Harry Potter exercise. Wave a wand and hopefully we'll get the profitability out of that we can. But how insane is that from a reporting and a management point of view? I mean, how do you run a business on that basis?
You can't. It just becomes more and more stressful and more anxiety ridden, and all you see are highly anxious agency leaders thinking, oh my God, now what are we going to do? Because and it's like running a conference. I've watched conference organizers. I mean, they yes, of course, they have their models where they know that at a certain stage, they as long as they've got this many people, then they can afford to do this. As long as they've got this many people, then they can afford to do that. But they get it wrong. And with all the best calculations in the world, and then there's all the freebies that happen with conferences, or all the freebies that happen with journalists or whatever. And then at the end, when you add the whole thing, like, you think, hang on a second, we thought we were going to make 1 million on this, but actually we've made 200,000. So it's that kind of and I would say the same with eventing. I mean, the event agencies at the moment aren't doing any work, obviously, because nobody can have events. So they tend to be focusing in other areas, design and all that kind of stuff. Eventing, what's that going to look like in whenever, how are events going to happen? What are the alternatives for marketers if they can't have events, because they've always had launches, or they've always had experiential? What's experiential going to look like? Now, the agencies that are thinking ahead have already devised what experiential could look like. They're not going to wait until everybody can go out again and blow up balloons and do whatever they do. They're already thinking about, okay, what in a digital world, because that's what it is, how do we do experiential? What is the new experience? And that's the kind of thing that you would actually want agencies to be starting to think about and to have thought about. And I think that COVID has given, in a way, has been a great help in terms of enabling agencies to, perhaps the forward-thinking ones, to have time to develop new ways of doing things, and not just working like this, but what other new things could we be doing that will be of benefit to ourselves and to our clients.
There is, and I think the conversation about forward thinking, so let's even call that future focus. What I've often said before is those businesses, and for the purposes of this Reed agency, that are future focused, that are seeing and working towards opportunities in the future, are the ones who will set the rules by which the rest of the industry will end up playing, or will have to play. Because of the redefinition of value, the redefinition of service, the redefinition of a business model. And when we talk about, again, whether we want to call it pivot, whether we want to call it change, whether we want to call it sort of re-opportuning the business, is to be aware of the fact that 8 out of the 10 most crucial things that a business has to do in order to effect a pivot are foundational things. They're not about marketing the product. They're not about just simply getting a new client to buy. It is foundational, that directly impacts how that business runs. And if that is not, if that's not achieved, if you don't get that right, unfortunately, that's not just the end of the pivot. It's most likely the end of the business.
No, that's true. And I think that's why I think people have talked about COVID being such a pivotal experience for so many people, because the greatest accelerator in digital advertising has been COVID, not the head of technology.
Exactly.
It maybe took 5 years to get to. It's taken 2 months for people to. In fact, I was reading a stat this morning. I think there's 4 times the volume on the internet that there was 3 months ago. 4 times the volume worldwide, simply because this is how we're working now. This is how we're communicating. Not all of us are communicating that way. I mean, there are a lot of people who are still in the manufacturing business and going into factories and going down mines and all that kind of stuff. But those of us who are in the digital world, and I think most people are actually, when they come home from working, they are doing something digitally. But yeah, the volume has upped by 4 times. Now, that wouldn't have happened as it would have happened, but it would have maybe taken 2 or 3 years. But actually, it's happened in 2 months. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as a closing remark from my side as well, is I think that COVID as a challenge hasn't created a lot of the issues. It's created a lot of opportunity, but it's not created a lot of the issues. In fact, a lot of the issues were pre-existing to COVID. All that it's done is it has exploded and put it more starkly into the spotlight. And so the question, I think, to businesses and agencies out there is, who's brave enough to raise a hand and say, yeah, what I'm seeing, what I've experienced, admittedly was there before. And how I get through this is about the step that I take from this point on, and look to future focus and future proof the business. And I think that's where the crucial conversation sits. That's where the smart strategy sits. And I think that's the kind of activity that we need to be seeing if we're going to take the agency environment forward in terms of value and service provision.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right.